Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a period that really reshaped the world as we know it, the end of the Cold War. It was this decades-long standoff between the U.S. and the USSR, right? This huge ideological battle with nuclear weapons looming in the background. But then, kind of suddenly, it all just unraveled.
Yeah, in the late 80s, early 90s, it was a pretty rapid shift when you think about the bigger picture.
Exactly. So, what we're going to do in this deep dive is try to figure out why. Why did this seemingly unshakable global order come crashing down? What were the forces at play, the political, economic, social factors that brought about this dramatic end?
It's a really fascinating puzzle, and like you said, it wasn't just a simple victory for one side. I think the real story lies in understanding the Soviet Union itself. You see, by the 1980s, it was facing some serious internal problems, some real weaknesses that made it incredibly difficult to keep up the fight.
Okay, so let's get into that. Where do we even begin with these internal weaknesses? The Soviet Union seemed so powerful for so long. What was going on beneath the surface?
Well, a big one was the economy. The classic command economy. It had worked for them to a certain extent, getting them industrialized and all. But by the 70s, it was showing its age. It just couldn't keep up. You need that flexibility, that innovation that you see in market economies, especially if you're going to be competing on a global scale.
And I remember reading about the oil crisis hitting them pretty hard too, right?
Oh, absolutely. You see, the Soviet economy had gotten really dependent on exporting oil. So when those global oil prices crashed in the 80s, it was a huge blow. We're talking a drop from $66 a barrel in 1980 to like $20 by 1986. Just a massive loss of income.
Ouch. And to make matters worse, they were still pouring resources into the arms race, weren't they? Especially with Reagan pushing that whole Star Wars defense system.
Yeah, that Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, it really ramped up the pressure. They were spending something like 25% of their entire GDP on defense. Just think about that. A quarter of their entire economy going to the military.
That's incredible. And, you mentioned them falling behind technologically, and then there's Chernobyl, right? 1986. That really seemed to expose some serious flaws, not just in their technology, but in their whole system, their ability to handle a crisis like that.
Oh, for sure. Chernobyl was a catastrophe on so many levels. And it really damaged their reputation internationally, too. It showed the world that things weren't as solid, as reliable as they had projected themselves to be.
It definitely shattered the image of Soviet competence, that's for sure.
For sure.
And it wasn't just the economy and technology where they were struggling. There was also the whole political situation. You had Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. These were pretty old, pretty set in their ways leaders, right?
Yeah, it was this real gerontocracy, wasn't it? This aging leadership, resistant to change, unable or unwilling to really confront these mounting problems. By the time Gorbachev takes over in 85, the system was already in a pretty fragile state.
And then Gorbachev comes in, and he's got these reforms, glasnost and perestroika, that were supposed to revitalize the Soviet Union, to modernize it. But it almost seems like, in trying to fix things, he accidentally made things worse.
Right. It's like he set off a chain reaction he couldn't control. Glasnost, meaning openness, was meant to create more transparency, allow for more open discussion and criticism. But it also unleashed decades of pent-up frustration and dissent. Suddenly, people were talking about the dark side of Soviet history, the crimes of Stalin. You had protests breaking out, especially in the Baltic republics, demanding more autonomy.
It's as if they opened a window and a whole storm blew in.
Exactly. And then there's perestroika, this economic restructuring. It was supposed to make the system more efficient, more decentralized, but what it actually did was create chaos. Supply chains broke down. Shortages became rampant. By 89, you had people standing in bread lines in Moscow.
It sounds like these reforms, well-intentioned, just threw the whole system into even greater turmoil.
Yeah, unintended consequences. And we can't forget the shifts in foreign policy under Gorbachev either. He pulled Soviet troops out of Afghanistan in 89. He signed major arms control treaties with the U.S., and crucially, he basically abandoned the Brezhnev doctrine.
That's the one where they said they'd intervene militarily to prop up communist regimes in Eastern Europe, right?
You got it. And by rejecting that, he basically gave the green light for those regimes to collapse. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 89 is the perfect example. Unlike in the past, the Soviets didn't send in the tanks. They just let it happen.
It's incredible to think about how different that was from their previous responses to uprisings in places like Hungary in '56 and Czechoslovakia in '68.
Absolutely. It was a major departure from the past. And, while all this is happening inside the Soviet Union, the West is also playing a role.
Right. It wasn't just an internal collapse. The Western powers were actively pushing back against Soviet influence, weren't they?
They were. You had Reagan taking a much tougher stance than his predecessors. He was providing support to the Afghan Mujahideen, deploying those Pershing 7 missiles in Europe, and really pushing the whole evil empire rhetoric.
That evil empire speech, that was a big moment. It really solidified the ideological divide between the two sides.
It did. But at the same time, you also have West Germany pursuing Ostpolitik, a policy of engaging with the East. This had been going on for a while under Willy Brandt. It was about building bridges, opening up communication.
And then with Gorbachev already in a weakened position, you have Helmut Kohl in West Germany pushing hard for reunification.
Yeah, and he seizes the opportunity, doesn't he? The 2+4 talks in 1990, they're fascinating. It's East Germany, West Germany, and the four main Allied powers, US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union, all hammering out the details of reunification. And incredibly, Gorbachev agrees to let a unified Germany join NATO. I mean, that's a huge concession.
Wow. And it feels like once those cracks started appearing in Eastern Europe, it was like a domino effect, one country after another.
It really was. It all starts unraveling really fast. You have the Solidarity movement gaining momentum in Poland throughout the 80s. And then in 89, they have those roundtable talks, and boom, the first non-communist government in the Eastern Bloc is formed.
It was a seismic shift. And that must have sent shockwaves through the rest of Eastern Europe.
Oh, absolutely. The other communist regimes were terrified. Then, in that same year, Hungary opens its border with Austria. It seemed like a small thing, but it was a huge symbolic breach of the Iron Curtain. And it provided an escape route for East Germans who were fed up with their government. Talk about pressure building up.
I mean, those images of East Germans streaming into the West, it was a sign that things were really changing.
It was. And then, of course, the Berlin Wall comes down in November of 89. And again, it wasn't some planned demolition. It was really this spontaneous moment fueled by confusion over new travel regulations and this overwhelming desire for freedom. It was a powerful symbol of the end of an era.
Yeah, the Berlin Wall coming down, it's one of those iconic moments in history that everyone remembers. And things didn't stop there, did they? Romania had its own upheaval that same year.
It did, yeah. December of 89, you have the violent overthrow of Ceausescu. It was a brutal end, a reminder of just how oppressive some of these regimes were.
It's amazing how quickly everything fell apart. The Warsaw Pact dissolved in 91, and then the Soviet Union itself breaks up at the end of that year. Just gone. 15 new independent states.
Just like that. You know, historians still debate what the main causes were, but there's no doubt that this was a pivotal moment in history.
It definitely was. And it's interesting how there are these different schools of thought about why it all happened.
Right. You have the traditionalists, like John Lewis Gaddis. They tend to focus on U.S. pressure, the military buildup, the economic strength. It was Reagan winning the Cold War, pushing the Soviets until they broke.
And then there are the revisionists, folks like Stephen Kotkin, who emphasize those internal problems we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
The economic stagnation, the political rigidity. For them, it was more of a self-inflicted collapse.
Yeah. And then you also have the constructivists. They look at the role of ideas, how Gorbachev's new thinking shifted things, this idea of shared security, of moving away from the zero-sum game of the Cold War, helped create the conditions for a peaceful ending.
So it sounds like there was this complex mix of internal and external factors that all came together at just the right time to bring about this huge historical shift.
Exactly. It wasn't just one thing. It was the Soviet decline, Gorbachev's reforms, Western pressure, the courage of those who protested against communist rule. It all played a part. And, you know, the end of the Cold War, it really shows how much things can change, how seemingly solid structures can just start dissolve.
Absolutely. It reminds us that nothing in global politics is truly static. It makes you wonder, what are the seemingly unshakable things in our world today that might be more fragile than they appear? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the end of the Cold War. It's a period that still has so much to teach us,